The story opens in the fortress of Henry Jenkins' world, an opulent study thick with cigar smoke and the weight of unspoken threats, where leather-bound books line walls that have witnessed countless dark negotiations. Henry, impeccably dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit that can't quite hide the serpentine tattoos crawling up his neck, sits at the head of a mahogany table, his cold eyes calculating profit margins measured in blood and silence. The atmosphere establishes a brutal contrast. Absolute power contained within refined elegance. A man who has built an empire by eliminating anything soft or vulnerable from his existence. The hook shatters this carefully constructed world when the heavy oak doors swing open, not by armed rivals or desperate traitors, but by impossibly small hands. A voice cuts through the tension, clear, unervingly calm for a child. "Excuse me, sir." 7-year-old Debbie Carbone stands in the doorway, her white-collared dress and dark cardigan pristine except for what she holds carefully between her fingers. The room freezes. The inciting incident strikes like a bullet when Debbie steps forward and presents her evidence with the composure of someone far beyond her years. "I found a red stain." She holds up a white handkerchief, its center blooming with fresh, unmistakable crimson. Henry's legendary composure, the very foundation of his fearsome reputation, crumbles in an instant. His face drains of color as he recognizes not just the blood, but the delicate embroidered initials in the corner. E.C. Eleanor Carbone. His voice, which has ordered executions without a tremor, now breaks as he whispers the question that will dismantle his entire world. "Where is your mom?" If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will shock you. You won't want to miss a single moment of Henry's desperate race against time. Henry's hand trembled, a betrayal his body hadn't permitted in 15 years, as he took the handkerchief from Debbie's outstretched fingers. The fabric was still damp, still warm, fresh. The men around the table shifted uncomfortably, their predatory instincts suddenly uncertain in the presence of a child holding evidence of violence they all understood too well. "Everyone out." Henry's voice had regained its edge, sharp enough to cut. "Now." They moved without question, filing past Debbie as if she were a landmine. Only one man remained. Cashin Wolfe, a broad-shouldered enforcer whose scarred knuckles told stories Henry's ledgers never would. Cashin's loyalty had been purchased with blood and tested with fire, and right now, Henry needed that loyalty more than air. The moment the door clicked shut, Henry pulled out his phone, his thumb moving with mechanical precision across the screen. Eleanor's number rang once, twice, 7 times before surrendering to voicemail. Her voice, calm, professional, achingly alive, invited him to leave a message. He tried her office line. Her sister's number. The secure line she used only for emergencies, the one that bypassed every protocol and connected directly to a burner phone she kept charged in her bedroom drawer. Nothing. Henry's jaw tightened as the implications crystallized with brutal clarity. Eleanor Carbone wasn't just his accountant. She was the architect of his financial invisibility, the woman who had transformed decades of blood money into legitimate holdings that even the FBI couldn't trace. She knew every account, every shell company, every buried transaction that kept his empire standing. She was the keeper of secrets that could either save him or destroy him, depending on whose hands they fell into. If she was taken, if someone had her, they didn't just have leverage, they had a nuclear option. But there was something else, something that made his chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with business. Eleanor had worked for him for 8 years, ever since her husband, a low-level associate who'd made the fatal mistake of skimming, had disappeared. Henry had made her a widow, then offered her the job that would keep her daughter fed and educated. It was transactional, clean, devoid of sentiment. Except somewhere along the way, Eleanor had become the only person who looked him in the eye and told him when he was wrong. The only voice that reminded him there were still lines he shouldn't cross. The closest thing to a conscience his blackened soul still recognized. And now her daughter stood before him, holding proof that Eleanor was bleeding. Henry crouched down to Debbie's eye level, studying the girl with new focus. She didn't cry, didn't shake, just watched him with those unsettling hazel eyes that mirrored her mother's calculating intelligence. "Debbie," "Where exactly did you find this?" "On the kitchen floor," she said simply. "By the back door. Mama's purse was there too, but her phone was gone. And her coat was still on the hook." Trap or crisis? The question hammered through Henry's skull. If this was Silas Varga's play, his ambitious underboss who'd been circling like a shark for months, then bringing Debbie here was either brilliantly reckless or catastrophically stupid. Henry stood, his decision made. Cash in. The enforcer straightened. "This girl doesn't leave your sight. She eats when you eat, sleeps when you sleep. Anyone gets within 10 feet of her without my explicit approval, you put them in the ground." "Understood." Cashin's eyes flicked to Debbie, then back to Henry. "Understood." Henry grabbed his coat, his mind already racing through scenarios, contingencies, and the names of men he'd need to wake up and terrify. Eleanor was out there somewhere, bleeding. And Henry was about to remind this city exactly why crossing him was a death sentence. The hunt had begun. Eleanor's apartment building stood in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood where soccer moms and young professionals lived blissfully unaware that one of their neighbors managed the financial backbone of the city's most dangerous criminal enterprise. Henry had chosen the location himself. Anonymous, middle class, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as the rent checks cleared. His SUV pulled up at 2:47 a.m., followed by 2 additional vehicles carrying men whose tailored suits couldn't quite hide the weapons underneath. The building superintendent had been persuaded to provide access with nothing more than a phone call and the silent promise that cooperation meant survival. By the time Henry reached Eleanor's third-floor unit, the door was already open. The apartment greeted him with eerie stillness. Soft yellow light spilled from a lamp Eleanor had left on. She always left one burning for Debbie, a small gesture of maternal care that felt obscene given the violence Henry knew existed just beyond these walls. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, a lipstick stain still visible on the rim. But Henry's trained eye caught what the ordinary observer would miss. A chair at the kitchen table had been knocked slightly askew. Faint scuff marks streaked the linoleum near the back door, the pattern consistent with someone being dragged. And there, barely visible against the white baseboard, a small smear of red that someone had tried hastily to wipe away. "Boss." One of his men emerged from the bedroom, his expression grim. "You need to see this." Henry moved through the apartment with predatory focus, cataloging every detail. Eleanor's bedroom was modest, a double bed with a quilted comforter, a nightstand stacked with financial journals and a worn copy of a children's book she'd probably been reading to Debbie. But behind the small oil painting of a seascape, the wall safe hung open like a broken jaw. Henry's blood turned to ice. He knew this safe. He'd had it installed himself 2 years ago, after Eleanor had proven her value extended beyond mere competence into something approaching indispensable. The safe contained backup documentation for their most sensitive transactions, the kind of records that could never be digitized, never trusted to any cloud or server. Birth certificates for shell company executives who didn't exist. Offshore account routing numbers written in Eleanor's precise handwriting. And most critically, the master ledger, a leather-bound book that cross-referenced every major transaction with the legitimate businesses they'd been laundered through. It was gone. Henry's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This wasn't even about ransom. Whoever took Eleanor knew exactly what they were looking for. Knew about the safe's location, knew its contents, knew that Eleanor would die before voluntarily revealing where Henry's money slept. "Check the lock," Henry ordered. "I want to know if it was picked, blown, or opened with the combination." His man produced a small flashlight, examining the safe's mechanism. No scoring, no damage to the tumblers. This was opened clean, boss. Someone knew the code. The implications detonated through Henry's mind like shaped charges. Eleanor would never give up that combination under any circumstances. She'd proven her loyalty by keeping his secrets even when he'd made her a widow. Which meant only one other person could have accessed it. Someone Henry had trusted. Someone inside his organization who knew Eleanor's importance, knew her routines, knew exactly which night Debbie would be staying late at her aunt's house. Except something had gone wrong, and Debbie had come home early to find her mother's blood on the kitchen floor. Henry pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Silas Varga's contact. His underboss had been pushing for more territory, more autonomy, more respect. Had been questioning Henry's recent decisions, calling them soft, suggesting that the old man was losing his edge. But accusing Silas without proof would either start a war or tip off the real traitor. Henry needed to be certain. "Dust everything," he told his team. "I want prints, DNA, any evidence someone was here besides Eleanor and Debbie. And find me the building's security footage for the last 48 hours. He paused at the doorway, his eyes settling on a framed photo of Eleanor and Debbie at Coney Island, both smiling like the world was safe. "We have maybe 12 hours before whoever has that ledger figures out how to use it. Find me something I can work with." Because if Silas Varga had Eleanor, Henry would burn down half the city to get her back. And God help anyone who stood in his way. The basement of Henry's private club had been designed for exactly this purpose. Soundproofed walls, a floor drain in the center of the concrete, and lighting harsh enough to make men confess sins they hadn't even committed yet. By 4 a.m., 3 of Henry's lower-tier associates sat zip-tied to metal chairs, their faces already showing the kind of fear that came from understanding they were in a room where mercy had been systematically eliminated. Henry descended the stairs with Cashin at his side, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. He'd left Debbie upstairs in his office with 2 guards and a tablet loaded with cartoons, a jarring juxtaposition that made his chest tighten in ways he refused to examine. Right now, he needed to be what he'd always been, a man capable of extracting truth through calculated violence. "Gentlemen." Henry's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "One of you is going to tell me who knew about Eleanor Carbone's schedule last night. Who knew when her daughter would be away. Who had access to information about my personal accountant's movements." The 3 men exchanged glances. Tommy Ricci, a dock supervisor, Marco Dante, who ran numbers in Queens, and Joey Calabrese, a driver who'd been with the organization for 6 years. All of them reported directly to Silas Varga. That fact alone was damning. "Boss, I swear, I don't know nothing about," Tommy started, but Henry raised a hand and the words died in his throat. "Wrong answer." Henry nodded to Cashin, who moved with practiced efficiency. The sound of Tommy's finger-breaking was crisp, clinical. His scream was muffled by Cashin's other hand clamping over his mouth. Henry pulled up a chair, sitting backward on it, his arms crossed over the backrest. "Let me explain how this works. I'm not angry. Anger is inefficient. But I am in a hurry, and Eleanor Carbone is bleeding somewhere in this city. So we're going to skip the part where you pretend to be loyal and move directly to the part where you tell me everything." Marco, the youngest of the 3, was already sweating through his shirt. "Mr. Jenkins, sir, Silas asked me to confirm when Mrs. Carbone's sister picked up the kid. Said it was routine security. I didn't think nothing of it. There it was. The first crack in the dam." Henry's expression didn't change, but something cold and predatory settled behind his eyes. "What else did Silas ask you to confirm?" He wanted to know when you'd be in your meeting last night. Wanted the exact time. Said he needed to coordinate some pickups in Jersey." Marco's words tumbled out faster now, desperation giving them momentum. "And he asked Tommy about the security codes for Mrs. Carbone's building. Said you wanted them updated." Tommy, cradling his broken finger, nodded frantically. "He told me it was your order, boss. Said you were concerned about her safety, wanted to test the building's vulnerabilities. I gave him the codes 2 days ago." Henry stood slowly, his mind assembling the pieces with mechanical precision. Silas had orchestrated every element. Isolated Debbie, accessed Eleanor's apartment with legitimate codes to avoid suspicion, and timed the kidnapping to coincide with Henry's meeting so he'd have maximum operational freedom. It was bold. Almost elegant. It was also a death sentence. "Joey," Henry turned to the driver, who hadn't spoken yet. "What did Silas have you do?" Joey's face had gone gray. "He had me drive him to Brooklyn last night. Told me to wait 3 blocks from Mrs. Carbone's building. When he came back, he had someone with him. Wrapped in a blanket. Unconscious. A woman." "Where did you take her?" "The old rendering plant. Out in Red Hook." Joey's voice cracked. "Boss, I swear. I didn't know it was Mrs. Carbone. I didn't know what he was planning." "He said it was a pickup," said you'd approved it, said. "Did he say anything else?" Henry interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. Joey hesitated, then nodded. "He made a call when we got there. I heard him say something about having the key, and that you'd be irrelevant by Friday. He was laughing, boss. Said something about how you'd gotten soft, how the organization needed someone who wasn't afraid to make the hard calls anymore." Henry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pure, distilled rage that transcended calculation. Silas hadn't just taken Eleanor. He'd stolen the ledger with the intention of using it to dismantle Henry's entire empire, probably selling the information to rivals or the feds. And he'd been arrogant enough to believe Henry wouldn't figure it out in time. Cashin cut them loose. Henry's voice was ice. "They cooperated. They live." The 3 men sagged with relief as Cashin sliced through their restraints. Henry headed for the stairs, then paused. "If any of you warn Silas, I'll kill everyone you've ever loved before I kill you. Understand?" They understood. Upstairs, Henry pulled out his encrypted phone, scrolling to a contact he hadn't used in months. The rendering plant in Red Hook was one of Silas's personal properties. A place Henry had allowed him to operate independently as a reward for years of service. That generosity was about to become Silas Varga's tomb. Dawnlight was beginning to creep through the blinds of Henry's office when he returned, his hand still carrying the phantom weight of the interrogation. He'd expected to find Debbie asleep on the leather couch, or perhaps crying for her mother, exhibiting some normal child node response to trauma. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor, methodically arranging his paperweights into precise geometric patterns. Circles within squares within triangles, with the kind of focus that reminded him unervingly of Eleanor during tax season. Cashin stood sentinel by the door, looking relieved when Henry entered. Even hardened enforcers didn't quite know what to do with 7-year-old girls who didn't cry. "Debbie!" Henry lowered himself into his desk chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years. "I need you to think very carefully. Before your mom, before she left, did she say anything unusual? Anything that seemed strange or out of place?" Debbie looked up from her paperweight arrangement, those hazel eyes assessing him with uncomfortable intelligence. "You're going to find her," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact. "Yes." Henry's voice carried absolute certainty, because anything less would be unacceptable. "But I need your help." "Did she say anything?" The girl was quiet for a moment, her small fingers touching one of the paperweights, a glass sphere with a preserved butterfly inside, something Henry had taken from a dead associate's desk years ago. "Mama was acting funny yesterday. She kept checking her phone and looking out the window. When Aunt Vivian came to pick me up for our movie night, Mama hugged me really tight." Debbie's voice remained steady, but something flickered behind her eyes. She said, "Remember, baby, if anything happens, the butterfly always lands where the king keeps his crown." Henry froze. "Say that again." "The butterfly always lands where the king keeps his crown." Debbie tilted her head. "I thought she was just being silly. Mama sometimes says strange things when she's working on the big books. She says numbers make her brain go sideways." But Henry's brain was going in a very specific direction. Eleanor didn't say random things. Every word she spoke carried layers of meaning, especially when it came to their business. The butterfly. The crown. She'd been leaving Debbie a message. Insurance in case something went wrong. "Did she give you anything?" Henry asked, leaning forward. "Anything at all," Even something small? Debbie reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a small object, holding it out on her palm. It was a button, ornate brass with an embossed design. Not modern. Vintage. The kind of button that would have fastened a military dress uniform from another era. Henry took it carefully, his thumb tracing the raised insignia, a crown above crossed swords. His pulse quickened with recognition. 20 years ago, before Henry had built his empire, before he'd become the name that made men look over their shoulders, he'd worked for a man named Victor Molnar. The king, they'd called him, a Hungarian immigrant who'd controlled the docks with an iron fist wrapped in old-world charm. Victor had owned a warehouse in Red Hook, a fortress of a building he'd run his operation from, and he'd always worn a military coat with buttons exactly like this one. When Victor died, a stroke, officially, though Henry had always suspected poison, his properties had been divided among his lieutenants. Henry had taken most of them, but he'd given Silas the Red Hook warehouse as a gesture of trust. Silas had converted it into the rendering plant, but the building's bones remained the same. The butterfly always lands where the king keeps his crown. Eleanor was telling him exactly where she was. In Victor's old warehouse, the place where the king had once ruled. And she'd somehow managed to leave this button behind, probably ripped from whatever Silas or his men had been wearing, knowing Debbie would bring it to the only person who'd understand its significance. Henry felt something crack in his chest. Admiration mixed with fear, mixed with an emotion he'd spent decades trying to eliminate. Eleanor hadn't just been taken. She'd been planning, thinking, protecting her daughter even as someone was dragging her away. She'd trusted that Debbie would find him. That he would understand. That he would come. Mr. Jenkins? Debbie's voice pulled him back. That means something, doesn't it? You know where Mama is. Henry closed his fist around the button, feeling its edges bite into his palm. Yes, he said quietly. I know exactly where she is. He stood, pulling on his coat, checking the Glock holstered at his side. Cashin straightened. Ready for orders. Get her to a safe house, Henry instructed, nodding toward Debbie. Somewhere even I don't know. Use the emergency protocols. Boss. Cashin began, but Henry cut him off. If I don't come back, she's your responsibility. Eleanor set up a trust. The details are in my desk. Make sure Debbie gets everything. He was halfway to the door when small footsteps followed him. Debbie's hand caught his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong. Bring my mama home, she said, and for the first time, her composure cracked just enough to show the terrified child underneath. Please. Henry crouched down, meeting her eyes. I promise. It was the first promise he'd made in 15 years that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something he'd thought he'd killed long ago. Then he walked out into the breaking dawn, heading toward the rendering plant where his underboss was about to learn that betraying Henry Jenkins didn't end with death. It began there. Henry's Audi tore through the pre-dawn streets of Manhattan with a velocity that bordered on reckless, something the meticulous crime boss would have never permitted under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Every minute Eleanor spent in Silas's hands was another minute she could be tortured for information. Another minute the ledger's secrets could be extracted and weaponized. Another minute Debbie's world could shatter irreparably. The city was stirring to life around him. Delivery trucks rumbling through intersections, early commuters shuffling toward subway stations, the working pulse of New York beginning its daily rhythm. Henry barely registered any of it. His mind was calculating trajectories, odds, the chess moves required to get to Red Hook before Silas realized his plan had been compromised. His phone buzzed. A text from one of his surveillance teams. 2 NYPD units active near Brooklyn Bridge. Accident blocking main route. Henry cursed, yanking the wheel hard right and accelerating down a side street. The police were the last complication he needed. His face wasn't exactly unknown to certain detectives who'd made careers out of trying to connect him to crimes they could never prove. Getting pulled over now, with a loaded weapon and murder in his eyes, would end this rescue before it started. He cut through Chinatown, the Audi's engine growling as he pushed it past parked produced trucks and early morning vendors setting up their stalls. His usual caution, the careful adherence to traffic laws, the deliberate invisibility that had kept him untouchable for years, had evaporated. Raw instinct had taken over, the kind of visceral urgency he hadn't felt since his days as a hungry enforcer fighting for survival rather than empire. Another text lit up his screen, this time from an unknown number. Jenkins. We need to talk about mutual interests. Call me. The area code was Miami, Konstantin Sokolov's territory. Word had already spread that Henry's operation was vulnerable, that his accountant was missing. The sharks were circling, sensing blood in the water. Rival organizations would be mobilizing, preparing to carve up his empire the moment they confirmed the ledger was compromised. Henry deleted the message and kept driving. The Brooklyn Bridge materialized ahead, traffic backed up from the accident his team had warned about. Henry couldn't afford the delay. He jerked the wheel left, cutting down toward the Manhattan Bridge instead, weaving between a taxi and a bus with inches to spare. Horns blared. He didn't care. As the bridge's steel cables rose above him, Henry made a decision that went against every operational principle he'd built his life on. He needed help from outside his organization. Someone Silas couldn't have corrupted. Someone whose loyalty came from blood rather than fear. He pulled up Eleanor Carbone's contact, Eleanor's younger sister, a nurse at Mount Sinai, deliberately kept distant from the darkness that funded her nephew's private school tuition and her sister's comfortable life. Henry had met her exactly twice. Once at a Christmas dinner Eleanor had insisted he attend, and once at a hospital after Eleanor had been in a minor car accident. Both times, Vivian had looked at him with barely concealed contempt, knowing exactly what he was even if she didn't know the specifics. The phone rang 3 times before her groggy voice answered. Hello. Vivian. It's Henry Jenkins. Don't hang up. Silence then. It's 6 a.m. If this is about Eleanor's taxes again. Eleanor's been taken, Henry interrupted, his voice stripped of its usual polish. Kidnapped. I'm going to get her back, but I need information only you would know. Medical information. The silence that followed was different. Alert. Terrified. Oh my God. Debbie. Debbie's safe. She's with me. But Eleanor's in danger and I'm running out of time. Henry merged onto the expressway, the rendering plant now less than 15 minutes away. Does Eleanor have any medical conditions? Anything that would require regular medication or treatment? Anything someone holding her would need to manage? Vivian's breath caught. She's hypoglycemic. Type 2 diabetes, managed with insulin. She needs to test her blood sugar regularly and inject before meals. If she goes too long without, her voice cracked. If she goes into diabetic shock, she could die, Henry. Or suffer brain damage. How long has she been missing? Henry checked his watch. Almost 12 hours since Debbie had found the blood. Since around 7 p.m. yesterday. Jesus Christ. Vivian's professional composure fractured. She would have missed her evening dose. Her morning dose. If they're not feeding her if she's stressed. Henry, you need to find her now. She carries emergency glucose tablets in her purse, but if they took that. They took everything. Henry's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Another layer of urgency. Another ticking clock. Eleanor wasn't just in danger from Silas's interrogation methods. Her own body was becoming a threat. There's something else, Vivian said quietly. Eleanor told me a few weeks ago that she'd been feeling watched. She thought maybe she was being paranoid, but she asked me to keep Debbie more often. She was scared, Henry. Whatever you're involved in, it caught up to her. The guilt was a knife between his ribs, but Henry had no time for it now. If I get her out, she'll need immediate medical attention. Can you be ready? I'm already getting dressed. He heard rustling, drawers opening. I'm bringing her emergency medical kit. Where? I'll text you an address once I have her. And Vivian. Henry's voice dropped. If I don't text you within 2 hours, Call the police and tell them everything. About me, about where I'm going, all of it. Eleanor and Debbie deserve that much. He ended the call before she could respond, the red hook exit sign appearing ahead like a gateway to hell. The rendering plant loomed in his mind. Its concrete walls, its isolated location, the perfect place for Silas to work without interruption. Henry checked his gun, chambering around with mechanical precision. His network was compromised, his empire was under siege, and the police were a constant threat. But none of that mattered anymore. He was done being careful. Done being the calculating businessman who measured every risk. Right now, he was just a man racing against time to save the woman who'd somehow become his conscience, and he'd burn down anyone who stood between him and that goal. The Audi roared into Red Hook as the sun finally broke over the Brooklyn skyline, painting the warehouses in shades of blood red and gold. The rendering plant squatted at the edge of Red Hook like a decaying monument to industrial brutality. 4 stories of rust-stained brick and shattered windows, surrounded by a chain-link fence decorated with faded, no trespassing signs that hadn't deterred copper thieves or homeless encampments in years. Henry parked 3 blocks away, approaching on foot through the morning mist rolling off the harbor. His Glock already drawn and held low against his thigh. The building's exterior showed no obvious signs of occupation. No vehicles parked nearby, no guards posted at the perimeter, no lights visible through the broken windows. But Henry knew better than to trust appearances. Silas was smart. He'd staged this to look abandoned while maintaining control from within. Henry circled the perimeter, his trained eye cataloging every detail. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel. A side door with a new padlock that gleamed against the corroded metal. And there, barely visible near a loading dock, cigarette butts that couldn't be more than hours old, the kind of expensive Turkish blend that Silas favored. Someone was home. Henry was about to test the loading dock entrance when his phone vibrated. A text from Vivian. Eleanor's insulin is Novolog. Clear liquid. If you see any medical supplies, look for a orange-capped pen injector. She needs 10 units minimum or she crashes. He pocketed the phone and moved to a ground-floor window, its glass long since shattered, offering a narrow view into the building's interior. The main floor was a wasteland of abandoned machinery and rotting pallets, but in the far corner, a single utility light burned, the kind contractors used, powered by a portable generator Henry could now hear humming faintly beneath the building's other ambient sounds. Then he heard voices. Muffled, echoing up from somewhere below ground level. The old rendering plant had a basement level where the actual processing had occurred, a warren of rooms with concrete walls thick enough to muffle screams. Henry slipped through the window, glass crunching softly under his Italian leather shoes. Shoes now ruined by blood and grime, though he barely noticed. He moved through the shadows with the practiced silence of someone who'd survived by being a ghost when necessary, descending a rusted metal staircase that led down into the building's bowels. The voices grew clearer. Silas's smooth baritone, edged with frustration. Eleanor, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I know you moved the offshore accounts. I know you created a failsafe. Just tell me the password sequence and this ends. Henry paused at the basement entrance, peering around the corner. The scene materialized like a nightmare given form. Eleanor, zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of a small room lit by work lights, her face pale and drawn, dried blood crusting the side of her head where someone had struck her. Her blouse, the one Debbie had said she wore yesterday, was torn at the shoulder, and her carefully pinned hair had come loose in dark tangles. But it was her condition that made Henry's blood run cold. Eleanor's hands trembled uncontrollably. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the basement's chill. Her eyes had a glassy, unfocused quality that Henry now recognized from Vivian's warning. Diabetic crisis. How many hours without insulin? 12? 14? Silas stood before her, his suit still immaculate. His expression one of practiced patience wearing thin. 2 other men flanked the room, Rico and Dante, enforcers Henry had personally promoted. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd anticipated. On a folding table near the wall sat Eleanor's purse, its contents dumped carelessly. Wallet, keys, phone with a shattered screen. And there, among the scattered items, Henry spotted an orange-capped pen, Eleanor's insulin, close enough for her to see but impossibly far from her bound hands. Psychological torture refined to an art form. "Your daughter is very brave," Silas continued, his tone conversational. "Bringing that handkerchief to Henry was clever. Eleanor, you raised her well. But Henry's not coming, and even if he did, this building is a fortress. So let's stop pretending and start talking about account numbers." Eleanor's lips moved, her voice barely a whisper. "Go to hell." Silas sighed, glancing at his watch. "You have maybe 2 hours before your blood sugar drops low enough to cause permanent damage. I've done my research. Diabetic shock, seizures, coma. It's not a pleasant way to die. Just give me the passwords and I'll let you inject. You can walk out of here, collect Debbie, disappear to whatever life Henry's money can buy you." It was a lie. Henry could hear it in the careful way Silas shaped the words. The moment Eleanor gave up the information, she was dead. The ledger's secrets were too dangerous, and Eleanor knew too much about Silas's ambitions. This was an execution dressed up as a negotiation. Eleanor knew it too. Even in her deteriorating state, even with her body betraying her, she kept her mouth shut. Protecting Henry's empire, yes, but also protecting Debbie. Because if the organization fell, if Henry was destroyed, there'd be no one left to ensure her daughter's safety. Henry's hand tightened on his Glock. 2 armed men, Silas potentially armed, and Eleanor in the crossfire. A straight assault would get her killed. He needed an angle, a distraction, something to shift the odds. His phone buzzed again. "Vivian. Is she okay? Please tell me you found her." Henry typed a single-word response. "Yes." Then he forwarded the message to a number he'd hoped never to use. The direct line of Detective Sarah Chen, the NYPD investigator who'd been trying to nail him for 8 years. He added 5 words. Henry Jenkins. Rendering plant. Red Hook. It would take Chen maybe 15 minutes to mobilize a response team. 15 minutes for Henry to either save Eleanor or die trying. And if he failed, at least the police would arrive in time to prevent Silas from finishing what he'd started. Henry stepped into the light, his gun raised, his voice cutting through the basement like a blade. "Silas, I believe you have something that belongs to me." The temperature in the basement seemed to drop 10 degrees as Henry stepped fully into the light. His Glock trained on Silas's chest with the kind of steady aim that came from decades of being willing to pull the trigger. The 2 enforcers went for their weapons, but Henry's voice, cold, absolute, froze them mid-motion. "Touch those guns and I'll put bullets through your spines before you clear leather. Eleanor dies, you die, and Silas dies knowing he failed." Silas turned slowly, and for just a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his face before being replaced by that familiar calculated smile. "Henry, I have to admit, I'm impressed. I thought the clues would lead you in circles for at least another few hours. How did you?" His eyes narrowed. "The child. Eleanor left her something." "Smart woman," Henry said, taking 2 steps closer, adjusting his angle to keep all 3 men in his sight line while moving toward Eleanor. She'd lifted her head at his voice, hope and warning warring in her exhausted eyes. "Drop your weapons. All of you. Kick them toward me. Do it now." Rico and Dante exchanged glances with Silas, waiting for their leader's signal. The hierarchy was clear. They'd follow Silas into hell if he asked, which meant Henry needed to break that loyalty immediately. "You know what happens when you choose the losing side," Henry continued, his voice carrying the weight of every execution he'd ever ordered. "Rico, your daughter just started at NYU. Dante, your mother lives in that nice assisted living facility in Queens. Think very carefully about what you're willing to die for today." It was a naked threat wrapped in pragmatism, and it worked. Rico's hand moved slowly away from his holster. Dante followed suit. Both men unholstered their weapons carefully, sliding them across the concrete floor toward Henry. Silas watched his men's betrayal with bemused detachment. Loyalty through fear. Classic Henry Jenkins. But you see, Henry, that's exactly why this organization needs new leadership. You've become predictable. Soft. He gestured casually toward Eleanor. Case in point. You're here for her. The accountant. A liability you should have eliminated years ago, but instead you let her become a weakness. The ledger. Silas. Where is it? Silas's smile widened. Oh, Henry. You're too late. Eleanor was remarkably resilient. I'll give her that. But everyone breaks eventually. The ledger is already en route to the Morozov brothers. By noon today, they'll have documentation of every dollar you've ever laundered, every politician you've bought, every business you've infiltrated. Your empire becomes their empire, and you become irrelevant. Henry's jaw tightened. The Morozov brothers, Russian mob enforcers who'd been trying to muscle into New York territory for years. If they had the ledger, they'd leverage it for a hostile takeover of his operations or sell it to the feds for immunity deals. Either way, Henry's world would collapse. But looking at Eleanor, her trembling hands, her pallid complexion, the way she could barely keep her eyes focused, Henry realized something that would have been unthinkable to him even 24 hours ago. He didn't care about the empire. Not right now. Not compared to getting her out alive. You made one mistake, Silas. Henry's voice dropped to something lethal. You assumed I'd choose the organization over her. You're about to learn just how wrong you are. Henry fired. The shot wasn't aimed at Silas. It struck the primary work light, plunging the basement into near darkness broken only by the secondary light's dim glow. In that moment of confusion, Henry moved. He'd mapped the room during his observation, knew exactly where Eleanor sat, where the enforcers stood, where Silas had positioned himself. Henry crossed the distance to Eleanor in 3 strides, his body becoming a shield between her and the guns now clearing holsters in the darkness. Muzzle flash erupted from Silas's position. The shot went wide, striking concrete and showering them with chips. Henry returned fire, forcing Silas to dive behind the metal table. Rico and Dante scattered to opposite sides of the room, their training kicking in as they tried to establish crossfire positions. Eleanor, Henry said urgently, producing a folding knife from his pocket and sawing through the zip ties binding her wrists. Can you move? Dizzy, she whispered, her voice slurred. Everything's blurry. She was crashing. Minutes away from unconsciousness. Maybe less. Henry caught her as she slumped forward, her full weight suddenly against him. On the far table, barely visible in the dim light, sat her insulin pen, 20 feet away, impossibly far with 3 armed men between them. Another shot rang out. This one from Dante's position, closer now. The bullet whined past Henry's ear close enough to feel its heat. Henry fired back twice, heard Dante curse and scramble for new cover. You can't win this, Henry. Silas called from behind the table. Even if you kill us all, the Morozovs have the ledger. Your organization is finished. But I'll make you a deal. Walk away now, and I'll let Eleanor live. She can take Debbie and disappear. You can die knowing they're safe. Another lie. Silas would hunt them both the moment Henry was dead. Loose ends in a world where loose ends got people killed. Henry shifted Eleanor's weight, keeping her behind a support pillar while his mind calculated angles, odds, the mathematics of violence he'd mastered over decades. 2 enforcers, 1 underboss, all armed. Eleanor barely conscious. Police en route but at least 10 minutes away. The insulin pen that could save her life sitting exposed on that table like bait in a trap. Rico moved in the darkness, trying to flank. Henry caught the motion and fired, the bullet sparking off metal pipe. Rico retreated, but the message was clear. They were coordinating, professional, trained by Henry himself to be efficient killers. You want to know what Eleanor told me before she broke? Silas's voice carried cruel amusement. She said you were the best man she'd ever known. Even after you killed her husband. Even after you dragged her into this life. She actually believes you're capable of redemption. Isn't that pathetic? Henry felt Eleanor stir against him, her fingers clutching weakly at his jacket. Don't listen, she managed. Didn't tell him anything. The ledger? Coded. He can't. A violent tremor ran through her body. Her eyes rolled back. She was out of time. Henry made his choice. He stood, firing rapidly at Silas's position. Not to kill but to suppress, to buy seconds. Then he broke cover, sprinting toward the table where Eleanor's insulin sat, his body exposed, gambling everything on speed and the chaos of the moment. Gunfire erupted from 3 positions. Henry felt a bullet graze his shoulder. Another tug at his coat. He crashed into the table, grabbed the insulin pen, and rolled behind a row of rusted machinery as bullets hammered the metal above his head. He'd made it. Barely. Blood warm on his shoulder, his heart thundering, but the orange-capped pen clutched in his fist like salvation. Now he just had to survive long enough to use it. Henry scrambled back to Eleanor's position, bullets chewing through the ancient machinery behind him, metal screaming against metal. She'd slumped completely against the support pillar, her breathing shallow and rapid, skin clammy to the touch. He had seconds, maybe less. His hands, steady even as gunfire erupted around them, uncapped the insulin pen with practiced efficiency. Vivian's instructions echoed in his mind. 10 units minimum. He dialed the dosage, pulled up Eleanor's sleeve to expose her upper arm, and pressed the pen against her skin, depressing the plunger. Come on, he whispered, his voice raw with an emotion he'd spent decades suppressing. Come on, Eleanor. Stay with me. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then her eyelids fluttered. Her breathing deepened slightly. It wasn't recovery, not yet, but it was enough to buy time. Henry. Her voice was thread-thin. The ledger. Didn't break. He doesn't know. I don't care about the ledger. The words came out before he could stop them, and he realized with startling clarity that he meant it. I care about getting you out. Silas's laugh cut through the darkness, sharp and mocking. How touching. The great Henry Jenkins, reduced to playing hero for his accountant. But here's the thing, Henry. You're not leaving. None of us are. Something in Silas's tone triggered alarm bells. Too confident. Too calm for a man pinned down in a gunfight he was losing. Rico. Dante, out. Now. Silas's command was absolute. Leave them. The 2 enforcers didn't question it. Henry heard their footsteps retreating rapidly up the metal staircase, their shadows disappearing into the upper levels. In seconds, the basement fell eerily quiet except for the generator's hum and Eleanor's labored breathing. Henry's combat instincts screamed danger. What did you do, Silas? Insurance policy. Silas emerged from behind the table, his gun lowered but his expression triumphant. You see, I expected you might actually find this place. I know you, Henry. You're resourceful when properly motivated. So I took precautions. He gestured toward the far corner of the basement, and Henry's eyes followed to spot what he'd missed in the chaos. A military-grade incendiary device, its digital timer glowing red in the darkness. The numbers read 247, 246, 245. Thermite charges, Silas explained conversationally, backing toward the stairs. Enough to turn this entire basement into a crematorium. The building's structural supports will collapse, burying everything. You, Eleanor, and any evidence of what happened here. The Morozovs get the ledger, I get control of your organization, and you get to die knowing you chose sentiment over survival. Henry's mind raced through scenarios. 2 minutes 43 seconds. Eleanor barely conscious, unable to walk on her own. The staircase behind Silas, the only clear exit. Could he carry Eleanor and make it out before the charges blew? Possibly. But Silas still held a gun, still controlled the exit, still had. "Henry!" Eleanor's voice, suddenly sharp with panic despite her weakened state, cut through his calculations. His jacket. Left pocket. Remote trigger. He can. Silas's hand moved toward his pocket. Henry didn't think. He raised his Glock and fired, not at Silas's center mass, not at his head, but at his left shoulder, the arm reaching for the remote. The bullet struck true. Silas screamed, spinning away, his gun clattering to the concrete. The remote tumbled from his pocket, skittering across the floor. 231. 230. 229. Henry lunged for the remote, but Silas, even wounded, kicked it away, sending it spinning under the rusted machinery. "You'll never find it in time." Blood streamed from his shoulder, but his eyes blazed with manic triumph. "We both burn, Henry. That's justice." Every instinct Henry had cultivated over his criminal career screamed at him to secure the kill. To put 2 bullets in Silas's head, to eliminate the threat permanently, to neutralize the enemy according to the rules of the world he'd inhabited for decades. Mafia protocol demanded it. Strategic thinking required it. But Eleanor was dying. The timer was counting down. And suddenly, Henry Jenkins, the man who'd built an empire on ruthless calculation, made a choice that defied everything he'd ever been. He turned his back on Silas Varga. "You're not worth it," Henry said quietly, holstering his gun and scooping Eleanor into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp against his chest. "You never were." He ran. Behind him, Silas's enraged screams echoed through the basement. "You can't just walk away. I'll destroy you. Henry! Henry!" 203. 202. 201. Henry hit the stairs, his shoulder screaming where the bullet had grazed him, his lungs burning, but his focus absolute. Eleanor's head lolled against his chest, her breathing more stable now but still dangerously shallow. He could hear sirens in the distance, Detective Chen's response team, probably less than 5 minutes out. He burst through the ground floor, navigating through the industrial wasteland by pure instinct, heading for the loading dock entrance he'd identified earlier. Behind him, he heard stumbling footsteps. Silas, wounded but mobile, trying to escape his own trap. Henry kicked open the loading dock door just as the timer hit 0. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. The thermite charges ignited with a sound like thunder compressed into a single heartbeat. White-hot flames erupted from the basement, superheating the air, turning structural supports into molten metal. The building's foundation groaned, then screamed. Henry threw himself forward, shielding Eleanor's body with his own as the shockwave blasted through the loading dock, showering them with brick fragments and searing heat. He rolled, absorbing the impact on his back, feeling ribs crack but keeping Eleanor protected, keeping her safe. They hit the gravel outside as the rendering plant began its final collapse. For stories of brick and steel folding in on itself, pancaking down with apocalyptic force. Dust and debris mushroomed outward, swallowing the morning light. When the world stopped shaking, Henry lay on his back, Eleanor cradled against him, both of them coated in gray dust and ash. He could taste blood. His entire body was a symphony of pain. But Eleanor's chest still rose and fell against his. Still breathing. Still alive. "Henry!" Her voice was barely audible over the ringing in his ears. You let him go." "I chose you," he said simply, staring up at the sky now visible through the settling dust. "I chose you, Eleanor. I chose Debbie. I chose something that actually matters." Police sirens wailed closer, multiple vehicles converging on the scene. Detective Chen would arrive any minute, would see Henry Jenkins at the scene of a catastrophic explosion, would finally have the evidence she needed to bring him down. Henry didn't care. He'd made his choice. And for the first time in 15 years, it felt like the right one. 3 weeks later, Henry stood in the doorway of a townhouse in Greenwich Village. a property so thoroughly scrubbed from public records that even the IRS couldn't connect it to his network. Inside, afternoon sunlight streamed through bay windows onto hardwood floors where Debbie Carbone sat cross-legged, arranging a new set of building blocks into the same precise geometric patterns she'd made with his paperweights that terrible night. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of tea, moving slowly but steadily. The pallor had left her face, replaced by color that spoke of proper rest and regular meals. The bandage on her head was gone, leaving only a small scar hidden beneath her hair, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "You're hovering again," Eleanor said, handing him one of the cups. Her voice carried a mix of exasperation and affection that Henry was still learning to navigate. "I'm ensuring security protocols are being followed," he replied, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, the kind of expression his face had forgotten how to make until recently. "Cashin checked the perimeter an hour ago. The building has more cameras than a casino. We're safe, Henry." She paused, studying him with those sharp hazel eyes that never missed anything. "You can't protect us from the entire world." "Watch me," he said quietly. The aftermath had been surgical and brutal. Detective Chen had arrived at the rendering plant to find Henry Jenkins covered in ash, cradling an unconscious woman, while the building collapsed with Silas Vargas still inside. The official story, crafted through lawyers Henry kept on retainer for exactly these contingencies, was that Henry had received an anonymous tip about his missing accountant and had heroically rushed to her rescue, barely escaping with their lives. Chen hadn't believed a word of it, but without bodies, without witnesses willing to testify, without the ledger that Eleanor had cryptically encoded and hidden in a safety deposit box under a false name, the detective had nothing that would hold up in court. The case remained open. Chen remained watchful. But Henry remained free. Silas Vargas' body had been recovered from the rubble 3 days after the explosion, identified through dental records, officially ruled a casualty of his own incendiary trap. Rico and Dante had vanished, probably running to Miami or Los Angeles, smart enough to know that testifying against Henry Jenkins was a slower death sentence than anything Silas had planned. The Morozov brothers had received a package containing the original ledger, every page blank, the real financial data never having left Eleanor's meticulous control. They'd retreated back to Brighton Beach, their attempted takeover dead before it began. Henry's organization had weathered the storm, but he'd fundamentally restructured it. New protocols, new leadership beneath him, and most critically, a wall of legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, investment firms, consulting agencies, that created layers of separation between the empire's darker elements and the life he was building here, in this sunlit townhouse, with Eleanor and Debbie. "Mr. Jenkins?" Debbie's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She'd abandoned her blocks and now stood beside him, holding up a drawing she'd made, 3 stick figures labeled in careful printing, Mama, me, and Henry. Something cracked in his chest, that same feeling he'd experienced when she'd asked him to bring her mother home. Eleanor watched the exchange, her expression unreadable but her eyes glistening. "It's for you," Debbie explained. "Because you saved Mama. Because you kept your promise." Henry crouched down, taking the drawing with hands that had ordered deaths and counted blood money but now trembled slightly holding a child's artwork. "Thank you, Debbie. I'll keep it somewhere safe." "Do you have a refrigerator?" she asked seriously. "Mama says important drawings go on refrigerators." "I'll buy one just for your drawings," he said, and meant it. After Debbie returned to her blocks, Eleanor moved to stand beside Henry, her shoulder brushing his. They watched the girl play in comfortable silence, a domesticity so foreign to Henry's previous existence that it felt like inhabiting someone else's life. "The legitimate businesses are performing well," Eleanor said quietly, slipping into the professional dynamic that had defined their relationship for years. "The consulting firm cleared $2 million last quarter. All clean money. The real estate portfolio is appreciating. In 5 years, maybe less, you could walk away from the other side entirely. If you wanted to." "And if I don't want to?" Henry asked, though he already knew his answer was changing. "Then you risk losing this." Eleanor gestured to the room, To Debbie building towers, to the sunlight and safety, to the fragile peace they'd carved from violence. You risk losing us. And I think we both know that's not a risk you're willing to take anymore. She was right. 3 weeks ago, Henry would have chosen the Empire without hesitation. Power, control, the fear-based respect that came from being untouchable, those had been the pillars of his identity. But watching Debbie arrange blocks with her mother's methodical precision, seeing Eleanor alive and recovering instead of dead in a basement, Henry realized that the Empire had always been a shield against connection, against vulnerability, against the terrifying possibility that something might matter more than control. I'm not walking away entirely, he said finally. Too many people depend on the organization for income. Too many families. But I'm restructuring. Compartmentalizing. The violent side operates independently, generates money that flows into legitimate enterprises. I become the businessman, not the boss. And this, he gestured to the townhouse to Eleanor and Debbie, this stays completely separate. Untouchable. Can you actually do that? Eleanor asked. Can you really live in both worlds without them bleeding into each other? Henry thought about Silas Varga, about the choice he'd made to save Eleanor instead of securing the kill. About walking away from protocol, from strategy, from everything his criminal life had taught him. I chose you over the Empire once, he said. I'll keep choosing you. However many times it takes. Eleanor's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that was both tentative and deliberate. Then we do this together. I manage the legitimate side, you handle the transition. But Henry, the moment it threatens Debbie, the moment our safety is compromised, we disappear. New names, new city, new life. That's non-negotiable. Agreed. Debbie looked up from her blocks, her face breaking into a rare smile. Henry, come help me build a castle. Mama says you're good at building things. Henry glanced at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. He set down his tea and crossed to where Debbie sat, lowering himself to the floor with an awkwardness that came from decades of never allowing himself to simply play. Debbie handed him blocks, explaining with absolute seriousness the architectural principles of tower construction. And Henry Jenkins, feared mafia boss, architect of a criminal empire, man who'd built his life on calculated violence, found himself building a castle with a 7-year-old girl while her mother watched with quiet approval. For 15 years, he believed that loyalty was purchased with fear and love was a liability that got people killed. But sitting on that hardwood floor, carefully placing blocks according to Debbie's exacting instructions while Eleanor smiled from the doorway, Henry understood something fundamental had shifted. Loyalty earned through protection was stronger than loyalty purchased with fear. Love that made you vulnerable also made you human. And maybe, just maybe, being human was worth the risk of losing the empire he'd spent his life building. The tower's leaning, Debbie observed critically. You have to balance it better. Show me how, Henry said. And she did. Patiently, methodically, with her mother's precision and none of his darkness. Teaching him how to build something that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Teaching him, Henry realized, how to build a life worth living. Outside, the city continued its chaotic rhythm. Deals being made, territories being defended, empires rising and falling with the same inevitability as the tide. But inside this townhouse, in this moment, Henry had found something that no amount of power or control could provide. A reason to become something better than what he'd been. The castle grew taller, block by careful block, while Eleanor watched and Debbie smiled and Henry Jenkins learned what it meant to choose love over fear. And for the first time in his carefully constructed life, that choice felt like victory. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't holding on to power. It's knowing when to let go for something that truly matters. Henry Jenkins built an empire on fear and control, believing that vulnerability was weakness and love was a liability. But when faced with losing Eleanor and Debbie, he discovered that the walls he'd constructed to protect himself had become a prison. Real courage wasn't found in calculated violence or strategic dominance. It was found in choosing connection over control, in prioritizing people over power, in being willing to sacrifice everything he'd built for the chance to become someone worthy of the makeshift family he'd found. If you've ever felt trapped by the life you've built, remember, it's never too late to choose differently. To prioritize what genuinely matters. To become the person the people you love deserve. Thank you for joining us on Henry's journey from ruthless boss to reluctant protector to something approaching redemption. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more thrilling tales, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling us your favorite moment and where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous thing you can do is care. But it's also the most human.